much space here at the New York International Auto Show on this issue is because, as John Bottella said, this is the future of where we're going. How quickly we get there, how we get there, and so forth may be a sort of an obstacle course, but the one thing is, in an environment like this, and also having it on social media, it's important to get out the message. So I've got a couple of questions, a couple of quick questions, and since I'm a political hack on things, I love politics, I watch C-SPAN, for those that know me, it's not surprising, on it. I do want to ask a couple of things. First thing is a little bit on the political side. And it's interesting because we were talking about, Carlos, a little bit about, China and where things are going. So I guess the question for the group is, when you take a look at EV adoption, it seems that Europe and China are definitely far exceed the US as far as the adoption of electric vehicles. So, just maybe to start with you, Elizabeth, is what's your thinking on that?
Yeah, I think it's going to come down to meeting the customer where the customer needs are at in this country. And the customer continues to say that the top reason for rejecting an EV is infrastructure build out. And right secondary to that is affordability. And so very encouraging to hear what's happening in New York. And this is an enormous country. And every state is almost like its own little country, if you will. And some states are much further ahead than others. So to reach that mass level adoption, it's going to be very geographic. Some states are going to get there quicker than others. In California, 1 out of every 2 vehicle shoppers that has a viable alternative actually buys it. So we can see dramatic differences in the states. That's number 1. And then number 2, affordability and the ability to communicate the total cost of ownership. There are a lot of variables. You heard about some of the state incentives that New York is offering. Well, Colorado has some excellent incentives, New Jersey. So the consumer now needs to do more of that online research in order to understand, or within the dealership space and the OEMs being able to communicate the total cost of ownership.
Let me just stay on this for a second, and maybe John, in some of these other countries, like in some of the countries in Europe and China, do mandates also play a key role in the adoption of it too? And how do you see that as a role?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that China has a 10 to 15 year head start on the United States with regard to the development of their EV industry. China is now the largest auto producer in the world. It's the largest EV market in the world and the largest auto exporter in the world. And so they have a head start. That head start is built on a commanding lead in the development and processing of the raw materials that go in the batteries. And so that's why I tried to make the point earlier that it's in our economic interests as a country to develop supply chains and to develop the industrial base to support electrification. So that's what's happening in China. Why? Yes, they do obviously have a very, very powerful set of government levers that they can push to increase demand for what they call new energy vehicles, as well as to use massive subsidies to support the development of their industry. By the way, they have too much capacity. They're making way more EVs than they can consume in China, and that's why many of them are going to the EU. And so this is what's happening in China.
Mike, let me just kind of jump, because I know you spend a lot of time in Europe and in Asia, visiting with other dealers and so forth. Is the climate there different as far as the embracing of electric vehicles?
Definitely.
And why would you say
that? Well,
that?
I agree with everything John said on China, and with regard to Europe, we got to remember our geographies are very, very different. And I think at its most basic, Americans don't like to be told what to do. We're fighters, and the vehicle, the car, is a symbol of freedom. It's the freedom to move around, to get your family to where you need it, to get to work. And it's always been that. And then we feel this pressure, and I know there's choice out there, but we're feeling a squeeze, and we're feeling an overall pressure from this government that we're being told what to do, and Americans don't like that.
Well, and that's exactly where I was going to take it next, because there was a story in, I think, the Wall Street Journal last week, and Carlos, maybe you have a viewpoint on this. It's clearly become a political issue, especially with the national campaigns that are coming on. How much of that is kind of an issue that is going to be an impediment to, or will it be a benefit, to the adoption?
Absolutely, absolutely. The conversation around electric vehicles is highly political, absolutely. And with regards to China, it does change the rules of the game a little bit, because they are more cost effective, so they are able to bring down prices. And in that sense, are able to introduce other fleets and other vehicles into the market that consumers will be able to bring into their households as well. But touching into the subject, because you did mention that you really like politics, how this is going to affect the election is that there is a perception that Chinese companies benefit from subsidies in the government and from tariffs and from protection. And what that's probably going to begin to influence as far as the political conversation is just whether the US or other countries really should start doing the same. And I think that a lot of voters are probably, which would be bad for globalization for sure, but it's probably an election tactic that many politicians may end up using as the election comes about, and as they try to bring home the subject of electric vehicles and the positive effect that it can have for the environment.
So just staying on that for a second, New York State obviously is a much more progressive kind of state than maybe others around the country. Do you see this as being an obstacle for the adoption, or how did you see this playing out in New York?
I think on the adoption side, it's all about consumer education. And one of the really difficult parts about this EV transition is who pays for that consumer education. So in New York State, we've invested some money in that, like just teaching a consumer, what does it mean to get an EV installed in your car or a charger installed in your home, right? Like simple questions. How will this affect my utility bill? All those kind of questions, I think, like the auto industry wants to promote their particular brand, but not do that kind of basic consumer education. But I think that's an all hands on deck thing. Like the state government needs to do it, the utilities need to do it, and the automakers and the industry needs to educate people on the benefits of EV, like the pleasures of charging at home, and then simplify the complexities of EV ownership and like total cost of ownership, explaining that in a more straightforward way. So those are all the things we've been focusing on at a state level to try to make the adoption easier for the consumer.
Yeah, Mike.
Well, I agree with that in theory, but most customers are focused on what fits into my budget. I need a monthly payment. I need to figure out how I'm going to get out of this old car and into a new one, because this one might be broken, to get to work. Total cost of ownership makes sense for people in the affluent. It doesn't make sense for somebody that needs a vehicle to drive. And I want to point out too, I forgot, this is about the environment, and we all talk about the different roles. The consumer is going to do what the consumer is going to do to fit their budget. That could mean holding on to the used vehicle for longer, which isn't good for the environment. So the consumer always wins in our business, and I think we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. And the consumer is not stupid. I mean, education is very important, but the consumers are always going to win, and that's not always going to be best for the environment, and that's what this is supposed to be about.
Yeah, I mean, the consumer is, no pun intended, is in the driver's seat when it comes to it, and it's a matter of, what kind of information, how they're processing it. I have to go back to politics for a second, because it's so much in my wheelhouse. When J.D. Power actually studies things, it's always about experience, about strong, hard data. Did they like it on it? But here's something that it's not a tangible item as much.
With electric vehicles, there is so much in the ecosystem that's affecting consumer sentiment, which is why we've started to run the surveys monthly, because to run it twice a year or once a year is no longer enough. And we are seeing something happens in the news, the Hertz story that you brought up, or the Chicago eclipse with the cold. We are seeing on a month to month that these stories do affect consumer sentiment on whether or not that they would consider an EV. So having the understanding of what happened in Chicago is going to be now a requirement for these consumers that read that story before they'll consider.
So I want to just mention that my wife's family is from Wheeling, West Virginia. So the politics in Virginia is a little bit different than it is for New York on it. So we keep it on a civil basis because we have one thing in common: we love, my wife on it. But there was a friend that came in with a Tesla on it, and the rumblings were really pretty intense on it. And then they all went out to do a test drive on it, and they loved it. It was a great drive. It was a great experience. And they go, wow, that's really interesting. But as you were talking about earlier and others on it, it was the economics, it was the charging, and that was the universal kind of issue that seems to go on. So here's the prediction, because I'm going to ask you your thoughts that in 5 years, where do you think this issue is going to be? Then we're going to invite you back in 5 years and see how well you did on this. Carlos, let me start with you. Where are we in 5 years on
In
this?
5 years, there's definitely going to be more EVs out there. There's going to be more adoption. But I think in 5 years, we're really going to begin to confront some of the answers to the questions that we're asking right now. How expensive is it going to be to maintain a car? Will there really be range? Will the electric grid be able to support it? And at the end of the day as well, whether it will be beneficial to the larger environment, to climate change, to get more people to continue to adopt them as well.
I can tell you my wish list. I want happy dealers, and for the dealers to be happy, I want consumers to be happy. I think in 5 years, I think your numbers are about 12%, Elizabeth. I see a much slower adoption to EV, and I think it's great that we're looking at plug-ins and alternatives. I see what looks to me like a hockey stick curve. I think is going to be a lot more gradual. And again, I hope I'm wrong.
Should I move it out to 10 years to see what we thought?
Maybe 15 or 20. I'd be comfortable there, but we'll see. We'll respond. We'll do what we need to do.
Great.
And I could do the counterpoint. I think in 5 years it will be the hockey stick. And the reason is battery cost, right? And cost to buy the vehicle, like you mentioned, that's the pain point now. And $100 a kilowatt hour is like that sweet spot where a battery EV, not a plug-in, but a full battery EV, is cheaper than the gas equivalent car to produce. And at that point, it's at the dealership and it's cost competitive with the gas equivalent. And then people just make the decision based on, is this more convenient for my lifestyle and my pocketbook or less? And with home charging, the answer is probably it's better for me on all counts, in which case then you just get that rapid acceleration and it becomes the dominant drivetrain.
Yeah, so they all copped out. They didn't give you a number, did they?
I know.
mean, Mark,
Like nobody
ask them
wants
for
to
the-
come
ask
back in
them for the
5
number.
years.
Yeah. Well, if you wait until 5 years, hopefully I'll be back sooner. Okay. So look, I think where we're going to be from an EV market perspective, we're talking about 2029, is we'll be probably in the 40% range in terms of battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Remember, there are multiple technology pathways. That's number one. Number two, to your point about politics, there is no question right now EVs are divisive. Why? Everything in this country is divisive. This is clearly a divisive issue. I don't know why, because if you drive one, they're great. What I do think will also happen over the next 5 years is the facts on the ground will speak for themselves. The market, customers experiencing great technology, and the fact that plants and investments, the entire industrial base is being transformed. And a lot of those investments are in states like Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Mississippi. And what do those states have in common? So I do think a combination of technology facts and industrial investment facts will also change the political debate to this is a cutting edge industry. We need to invest in this cutting edge industry, and we need to win through competing with other countries for the future of the industry.
And that, we were touching base this on the other day about the mining issue and, how far it seems like the United States may be behind from countries like China, so there's a whole other area on it. So Elizabeth, you willing to give a number?
I'm closer to with John. I think we're going to definitely be into the 30% range by 2020, 29. And the consumers already backed that up with the 29% very likely willing to consider an EV for new vehicle shoppers. We do see that that has come down, but we know that we have the potential to get back up to that. And as the infrastructure continues to build out and the consumers can see it, and as the education is applicable, the attitude will continue to grow positively towards electric vehicles.
Great. Well, listen, this is a very challenging time, very complex. In some ways, it's exciting because that's what the auto industry is about, is the changing technology. I used to tell the story that when I used to sell parts for foreign cars years ago, you'll probably get a sense, is I used to stand on top of the bins on the shelves and look down with an item, and I said, well, this is close enough, this should work. That whole world has changed dramatically on. And the one thing that we haven't touched on that's extremely important too is getting our workforce up and developed so that they too can be able to address the technology in electric cars. So a lot of moving parts to this, a lot of interesting things that go on, and I'm sure this discussion will go on for quite some time more. But please thank the panel for all their insights and discussions. The test track is open for anybody who wants to test some of the vehicles here. I hope you enjoy the rest of the show, and thank you so much for attending. Thank you.